Alright, guys, we have confirmation Sakusa will be the next character coming around. Now, this is probably no surprise to you guys because it has already been leaked around. I know in advance as well because I am part of the content creator program, but officially we're not supposed to say anything till today. So that's kind of why I was holding on this info till today. But anyway, today I'm going to talk about Sakusa as a unit and do a review on all of his kit, but then I will also make a separate video tomorrow talking about whether or not you should actually summon for Sakusa. Now, the reason why I'm splitting this into two videos is that today's video I want to be as factual as possible, and that's kind of why I'm just going to review his skill resonance, and talk about my opinion on it. However, in tomorrow's video, there's actually a bit of uncertainty in terms of whether or not you want to summon for Sakusa, and that's because we don't actually know the stats that Sakusa will be coming out with. Now, just to give you guys an idea, but obviously I'll talk a lot more in depth in tomorrow's video. But basically, Sakusa on JP and Taiwan server, they have stats equivalent to an SP character because Sakusa and Komori was released after all of the SP character. Okay, so essentially, even though he is classified as a UR character, his raw stats is higher than all of the other UR characters. However, on global, this can potentially be different because obviously we don't have SP characters right now. If they just release this character right now with SP character stats, then obviously he's going to power creep everyone else. However, there is also a possibility that maybe global would actually nerf him and give him only a UR equivalent level of stats. We don't exactly know which direction it's going to take until the character is actually out on Wednesday. So that's going to, there could be some kind of speculation and things that you have to be aware of before whether or not you actually want to summon for him. And that's kind of why I'm going to keep that video to tomorrow. And today's video is just going to be a lot more factual about things that we know for certain. Okay. So let me just do a quick rundown of all his skills and then also skill resonance, and I'll finish off with his memory as well, okay? So starting off with skill 1. So this one basically buff up his power attack and also his receive. When you actually receive, you're also going to increase your power attack. When you do your power attack, you're also going to increase your receive. So basically in an ideal scenario, you should be almost like playing your receive and spike alternatively, all right? Or you alternate between the two actions. However, in reality, you can't control whether or not you will actually be the one receiving. And this could also have a problem on in terms of the way he's going to buff up his power spike, because it's that whenever he receives, you are going to stack up, you are able to increase it, and this can stack up to 3 times. So basically each individual stack is not actually that high. However, because you can't control, he will be the one receiving, and a lot of time, a lot of the receives will actually be going towards your liberal, who has stronger receiving skills, etc. So that's kind of why, even though this is very nice on paper, vast majority of the time you probably will only be able to stack this up only once before you don't have to use an ultimate attack, and that will obviously consume of your stacks, okay? So even though this is supposed to buff your power spike and also receive, you can't really tell. This is actually going to improve your receive a lot more than improving your power stack, because the receive is just a one-time buff, one time till your next receive. However, your power attack buff is actually going to be based on the number of stacks, and like I said, vast majority of the time you can only get really up to 1 stack. Okay, so that's something you want to be aware of in terms of skill 1. Then in terms of skill 2, so this one's quite interesting. So it's just a receive skill, which is based on a scaling all the way from 150 at level 1 to 190 at level 3. However, depending on your receiving power, when you do actually do this receive, you're actually going to get some permanent buff. So if it's more than 170, you're going to increase your reflex by 10%. And once again, also reducing the cooldown by 2 necrotic, and this will last till the end of match. And same thing, if it's actually more than 200% scaling, you're actually also going to increase your defense technique as well till end of match. This is actually a super strong buff because it lasts for the whole match, okay? Now, one thing you may be thinking is how can I actually get this to more than 200% scaling when the skill itself, even at max level, is only 190? Now, this is where the damage formula is going to come in. I already created a video on this before, so you guys can check it out on my channel. I'll probably also link it in the comment section if I can remember. But basically, when you actually perform a receive, it's not just purely based on the scaling of your stats. There's also other things that come into play, such as defense technique and also whether or not you actually do a crit. So in order for you to actually get more than 200% of your receive, especially let's say if your Sakusa is only at level 1 skill, you basically effectively have to put in like, let's say a 34% defense technique, or you just happen to have to do a critical receive when that happens, okay? So that is going to determine the way you actually want to build your potential. There's also another way of doing it, by the way, is that you play him alongside with Komori. Their deployment bond skill also would be increasing their receive skills, okay? So that is also another way you can do it. But basically, you just have to make sure you build your character, especially on the potential side, in a way so that you can make sure you definitely get him over 200%, because this buff is actually very, very nice, okay? So that's something you want to be aware of when you are kind of like playing around the build on Sakusa. Now for skill 3, I'm going to use Narusan instead, because I realized the doc I was referring to earlier, the description got cut off in the middle, so it doesn't have the full description. So that's why I'm using this one here. But basically, whenever you are on the court and someone make a critical receive, save, or block, you are going to get 1 stack of this perfectionism. It will increase your receive, increase your power hit, and also when you actually do your power hit or your power spike, it's also going to increase your awareness based on how many stacks, okay? So this is a super strong one, and a lot of the way where you're trying to play Sakusa optimally, it's going to be try to get as many of those stacks as possible before you do off your spikes, okay? Now, all of these stacks will actually be consumed when you actually do your power spike, but also in return, you're also going to get your increase to your reaction, so your reflex rate, depending on how many stacks is actually consumed, okay? Maximum 20 stacks. So in theory, you can actually get also this increased by level 3, okay? So this can go to 2.4%. So in theory, you can go as high as 48% increase to reflex, which is actually really, really high. And also, of course, awareness can also be increased depending on how many stacks you have at the point of the power spike, okay? Now, there's something which is also interesting. This translation is not very good, but basically you actually have to score for this to trigger. So you need to score with your power spike, or maybe you have actually won the point in the rally that Sakusa made that power spike, okay? But when that actually happens, you also start off with 5 stacks of perfectionism effect straight up, okay? And this is actually going to be quite important, because without this ability, if you actually want to get 5 stacks, that normally requires 5 critical receive or critical blocks, which can actually take quite a bit of time before you're able to build it up. So this is actually going to be very important. And also this is a bit of a trick of how to actually play Sakusa optimally, is that you want to make sure you only use Sakusa for those spikes where you're almost certain that you're actually able to score from that. So basically, let's say only when your setter is doing a perfect set, okay? Because when he does a perfect set, Sakusa will be doing a perfect spike, and that obviously will increase, well, in theory, it should increase the likelihood of you actually winning that point. So that's something you also have to bear in mind with. Now, another thing which can also potentially be a bit cheeky, but you can potentially consider it. I'm not sure whether or not I actually want to recommend it, but basically this doesn't actually get consumed until you spike. So in some sense, you can also basically just use this to giga buff your receive. And remember, from his skill 2, you can actually reduce his receive skill by 2 net crossing as well. So you can potentially actually spam his receive to some extent. And if you just get up to 20 stat, but they never actually consume it, by not spiking at all, what's then going to happen is that you can actually increase your receipt by 120%. And that can also be massive, okay? So you can potentially also build him as a full receive if you really want to. I don't know whether or not I would recommend it, because it is a bit of a waste, because he can hit very, very hard as well. But that is basically another cheeky way of how you can potentially build Sakusa. Okay, now I'm going to switch back to the doc to talk about his ultimate skill and also skill readiness, etc. Okay, so his ultimate skill, this is just a power spike, but it's going to be buffed up if you are actually standing at the back. Now this is quite nice, because a lot of time you should be at the back already, because he does have very good receiving skills, okay? And there's also a bit of a synergy with Hoshimi Korai, because Korai actually get a buffed up spike whenever he's at the front row. And right now on global, because we're fixed to play this team rotation, the 2 win spike will be opposite to each other. So whenever Korai is out from, Sakusa have to be at the back, okay? So there's a bit of synergy here in terms of team rotation. Then the second half of this ability is that whenever this is at your critical spot, you're also able to reduce the enemy's receive. Now this is also very nice, because first of all, he can already get very high increase in terms of his awareness rate because of his passive in terms of his skill 3. A lot of time you are already looking at like a 50% increase in terms of his awareness rate. And then if this happens to be a crit, which like I said, very easy to trigger, then you're also able to reduce the receive, and that makes it easier for you to actually win that point with his spike. And if you remember what I said earlier from his skill 3, if you actually manage to score with his spy, you are then also able to get 5 stacks of perfectionism back. And that, once again, means 50% guaranteed increase to awareness. So there's actually a very good feedback loop between his skill 3 and skill 4, and the two kind of just work together from that sense as well, okay? So this is both easy to trigger and also help out with the rest of his kit. Now let's talk about his deployment bond and also skill resonance. Deployment bond is going to be with Komori. This one is going to increase its own power spike and also Komori's receipt, but most importantly, also increase the receipt for your whole team. I believe it's 20%, which is actually very, very nice. And also it's nice in the sense that it's universal. And that's kind of what makes it easy for Sakusa and Komori to be played. A lot of times they're actually been sort of as kind of like plug in and play type of character. So if you just happen to have a liberal and also wind spiker slot left on field, you can always slot them in because they just have this very good deployment bar, which is going to be beneficial regardless of the rest of the teammate. Okay, so that's kind of what makes this deployment bar very strong. And then in terms of skill resonance 2, you're going to start off with 5 stacks of perfectionism. This is actually quite nice in the sense that basically allows you to start off the match already having his spike ready. If you don't actually have this, what may actually end up happening is that if you actually want to guarantee his spike to be crit and then therefore reduce enemy receive, etc., you actually have to wait a few turns for all of the rest of your team to do critical receive and critical block to actually build up that stack first. Okay. However, with this, basic Sakusa can do it straight off the match. Then the second ability this have is that whenever he do a serve, you're also able to reduce the enemy awareness and also strength. Now the debuff number here is not massive, however it does last for 8 net crossing, so it's actually quite nice from just like duration, longevity point of view, okay? And then the last ability this have, which is probably arguably the most important out of all the skill resonance event, is that whenever you consume perfectionism, you're also able to increase the reflect for your whole team, okay? This can be up to maximum 24%, which is actually massive. Now this is massive because a lot of characters actually have kits which are going to be relying on critical actions. However, what you guys may have already realized by now is that we actually have loads of characters which can increase awareness, but not so many characters can increase reflect for the whole team. So this is actually one of the few abilities which are able to do so. And that makes it very, very valuable, especially in the future when you actually want to play Sakusa alongside with characters such as SP Hinata, whose whole kit is going to be relying on, for example, you doing a critical receipt. So having this somewhat rare but very, very strong ability to buff up the reflex for the whole team, that's actually going to be a massive win for Sakusa. And this is kind of the skill resonance that I'll highly recommend people to go to, okay? Skill resonance 2 is a very important skill resonance for Sakusa. Then skill resonance 4 is kind of going basically just a very nice buff in terms of his strengths, in the sense that basically depending on your critical receive and block, you can apply 10% of that reflex into another stack called breakthrough, and then that can be stacked 15 times. So basically maximum you can get 150% increase to your strengths. Now this is actually very, very massive in terms of number one, and to be honest, it's also somewhat easy for you to trigger because basically to get a 15% stack, that basically requires a combined reflex rate of 150 reflex. However, this is not just from 1 or 2 action because this effect is going to last until your next power spike. So vast majority of the time between your 2 power spike, you are easily going squeezing at least 6 or 8 actions. So as long as out of your 6 or 8 receive and blocks, you are able to actually trigger some of them to be crit, and then when those happens do trigger, you have a combined 150% reflect, which once again is quite easy to reach considering you already can give 24% to all of your teammates. This is actually very, very easy to get 150% increase in terms of his stress. So this is obviously very, very nice. It's going to be up to you whether or not you think this is worth it or not, because for me, it's kind of like very, very strong ability, but it's not going to change the game mechanics for Sakusa. Unlike his skill resonance 2, for example, increasing awareness can basically increase consistency for loads of your other character synergy, etc. So for me, personally, I think skill resonance 2 is a lot more important than skill resonance 4, but that's not to say his skill resonance 4 is not good, okay? 150% increase in strength is just going to be massive. Okay, I'm not denying that. It's just that it's not going to change any of the game mechanics for Sakusa or for the rest of the team, which skill resonance 2 does. And that's kind of why I place a higher priority for Sakusa skill resonance 2, okay? Last thing I'm going to talk about is going to be for Sakusa's memory, and this one have basically 3 effects. Effect number 1, increased power spike. That's pretty standard. Lots of wind spike memory have that. Effect number 3, when you receive, you're also going to increase your spirit. That's quite nice. Better your crit damage for receive. That's also pretty nice. But a lot of time you'll be playing Sakusa more for the offensive capability, so the relevancy of that is not massive. The one which makes it the most interesting, but also the most controversial, I guess in some sense, in my opinion, is going to be the one I highlighted, which is basically saying that when he receives, you are going to increase your attack technique by 15%, for 2 net crossing. Now, the buff itself is very nice because attack technique is actually pretty rare to increase a lot of time, and also 15% pretty high as well because that's pretty much is essentially the same as your main stat from your slot 6 potential, okay? So it's definitely a very good buff. But because it only lasts for 2 net crossing, what that basically means is that you have to spot in the exact same turn you receive. Now you guys may be thinking, that's easy, I'll just receive and spot. However, that's easy on paper. In practice, there are actually going to be 3 dependencies for this to happen. And that's kind of why, personally, I actually feel like even though this memory sounds very, very good on paper, in practice, you may not actually be able to trigger this effect often, okay? So what are those 3 hurdles you have to jump through? So hurdle number 1, you actually have to be the one receiving. Now, this is actually already quite difficult by itself because depending on the rest of the team, a lot of times Sakusa will be built with power spiking potentials, okay? You won't be building him with very high receipt, whereas your other defensive characters, you will actually be building up with high receipt. So whether or not Sakusa can even receive the ball it's already going to be difficult because from what I've seen so far, a lot of time the ball tends to have higher priority going over to character with higher receive stat or higher receiving scaling skills. And Sakusa's one is just going to pale in comparison to other dedicated receivers. So that's kind of why whether or not you can even get Sakusa to receive is already going to be somewhat of a hurdle. Hurdle number 2, he also have to spike in the same turn that he received, okay? A lot of time, unless you have your ultimate spike, otherwise you wouldn't even be choosing him, all right? Because you would just be choosing a different character as ultimate spike. So what that basically means is that there could be a very bad scenario where you have used your ultimate spike already early on, and then it just so happens your Sakusa finally meant to receive, you don't even have your skill available, and you're not going to do a normal spike with him, okay? So that's one way it can go down. Or the other way it can go down is that until you receive, you have to keep on holding on to his ultimate attack. But I already said, right, it can be very, very rare for him to even receive. So if you're actually going to hold on to his ultimate skill for that long, there could actually be a chance you'll be bricking yourself in terms of your spiking rotation. Especially, let's say, if you also play other characters such as SP Bokuto, who can only spike doing Team Morale Awakening, etc. as well. Then, unless you have loads of other good spiking options, enough for Sakusa to keep on holding his ultimate attack for that long, otherwise you could also be bricking yourself in terms of your spiking rotation, okay? So that's the second reason why this may not actually be ideal, and a lot of time you may actually be forced to actually use his ultimate spike beforehand before he actually do a receive, and then by the time he actually receive, you're not going to spike anyway, okay? So that's the second hurdle. And then this number 3 hurdle, this is a bit of a small one, but once again, it's going to be a bit of a dependency. And that's going to be, you can only do this when you actually receive, which basically means he has to be at the back, okay? Now, in terms of your team rotation, this can be 1 turn, it can be 2 turns, it can be 3 turns, okay? Maybe to get the most out of it, you want to play Sakusa in the surfing position so that he can actually stay at the back for 3 turns. But a lot of time, what this also means is that there could be equally another good character, such as there's a SP Hinata, who also prefer to be at the back, or SP Wazuyumi, who also prefer to be at the back. But because you have to play Sakusa at the back for 3 turns, you are forced to only play the other characters at the back for only 2 turns, okay? So yes, you may still be able to trigger depending on how your team rotation goes, but it may come at a sacrifice of your other character's capability as well, okay? So that's kind of what overall, if you actually think about it, even though as good as this memory may seem, if you actually trigger it, 3 different hurdles you have to trigger, okay? That's a lot. If it's just 1 or 2, you might be able to get away with it, but with all 3 of them combined, if I just summarize it quickly, it's going to be dependent on the rest of your receivers in your team. It's going to be dependent on the rest of your spikers on your team in terms of spiking rotation here. And it's also going to be dependent on your team rotation, first of all, so it's how many turns Sakusa is actually going to be at the back, okay? 3 different hurdles for you to jump through just to get this spot. Is it going to be worth it or not? That's going to be up for you guys to decide, okay? Now, one other thing I will briefly mention, but I'll talk more in tomorrow's video, is that whether or not Sakusa's memory is actually going to be of UR stats or of SP level stat. Because if this memory is actually of SP equivalent stat, then you could also argue from the raw stats point of view, this is actually already a power creep of the other UR memories. So you could also make that argument from that perspective. But purely in terms of the effect perspective, I'm just going to point out, even though this looks good on paper, may be difficult to actually trigger or trigger multiple times in an actual match, okay? But yeah, so that's going to be it for this video. But remember, I will be posting another video tomorrow talking about whether or not you should actually summon on Sakusa, okay? So do tune back for that video tomorrow.